Welcome to Whisperwood Stories. Today, we read 2 stories from r/nosleep. Let's begin. Our first story is from SadStoodUpBoy. Why Babies Cry. It's one of the worst sounds ever, isn't it? Babies crying, screaming. Nothing you can do will make them shut up. You feed them, you change them, you rock them, you cuddle, sing, and do everything you can think of. Yet, they scream. You would do anything if you just knew what they wanted. But you have no way to find out. They can't tell you. I can. I'm a unique individual, I guess you can say. There are others like me. We even have a Discord now. I miss the days when we had a forum and everything was easily archived. But times change. And so do we. The only ones we can really talk to is each other. Nobody else believes us. We're trapped, knowing the truth, yet unable to convince the world that we're not lunatics. Lunatics. I guess we are, sorta. We lost our minds a long time ago, because we can't forget. We know why babies cry, because we were once babies ourselves. And unlike the vast majority of people who don't start forming memories until they're older, we were different. We remember everything. You see, babies are still in limbo, so to speak, when they're born. Their soul, souls are real. Their soul isn't quite separated from where we come from, and the human body we inhabit. How do I know that? Well, I remember that part too. I was floating in the nether, unsure of why I was no longer driving my children to Burger King. And then I caught a flash of the accident that took my life. Before I could process what happened, I was judged. Being judged isn't like what you think. There are no pearly gates, golden roads, or mansions in the sky. You're simply judged. Bad? Well, that's what hell is for. Good? Great. You get sent back to Earth. Recycled, reincarnated, whatever. Thing is, the better you were in your previous life, the better you end up the second time around. Some people are stuck in the gray area, which is where I ended up. Those in the gray area are sent back, but instead of being given a better position, they're given a worse one. Round 2 is harder, even though you're not supposed to remember a damn thing about what you did wrong. So how can you change a damn... Sorry, I'm getting on a rant. Bottom line, the system is rigged against you. Every good soul is going to end up in a bad situation where they don't make the best choices eventually. The law of averages is going to prevail. For those starting in a worse position than they previously had, they're already headed towards the wrong end of the gray area. You see that, right? I'm not crazy. Why? Who knows? There doesn't appear to be a god or anything. It's just an automated system where you're whisked towards your destination. An algorithm measures your worth, and you're sent on to your next life. The whole experience is jarring, to say the least. I don't have the luxury of remembering any life before my previous ones. Other guys on the Discord say they can remember multiple lives, but we've attracted some weirdos to our group over the years, and sometimes it's hard to know who is actually telling the truth. I was sent back to Earth less than an hour after I was driving my kids to Burger King. I didn't know if they lived or died. All I knew is that I was dead. So yeah, I came out of my new mom screaming. Wouldn't you? Turns out, that wasn't the only thing that I would have to scream about as the days passed. You see, hell is a terrible, terrible place. Probably is that all those souls down there, all those souls that were bad in their previous life, yeah, they found a loophole. The barrier that exists between the real world, if you want to call it that, and the afterlife is pretty damn thin. With the right amount of effort, and a host that hasn't quite fully connected with their new host, that's a body you can take. So imagine you're a baby. You just got born. You're still remembering bits and pieces of your previous life while trying to figure out why you're a baby. You scream. You scream a lot. But the bits and pieces begin to fade. There's that moment where you're becoming a baby. You're forgetting everything. Then you're laying in your crib in the middle of the night. Open your eyes, and there's a demon peering down at you. Those paintings you've seen of demons? Pretty accurate. There are other people that have remembered all throughout history. Some big, some small, all hideous. In order for them to break through, they gotta make you give up. They need you to separate from the host. With the right amount of fear, it can happen. But regardless, you're screaming. You're screaming your head off all night long some nights. When you should really worry is when the baby stops screaming. Either the demon has given up, or they got your little bundle of joy. Congrats. You're now raising the reincarnation of Ted Bundy or Charles Manson. It's a vicious cycle. And where do the souls go that give up and detach? Nobody knows. None of us have ever met one. The little that we do know has been pieced together from bits and pieces of memories, assembled into something that is almost cohesive. Luckily, most of that was done before we started sharing our story, and attracted a lot of people who believe in the Mandela effect and space aliens. One of those is crazy. I'll let you figure out which one it is. But yeah, that's all I've got for you. I thought I'd tell you why babies cry, and now you know. They're either mourning a life they still remember, or staring down at a demon. Sometimes more than one. Hell, maybe we should all be screaming. Our last story is from Bourne Beach. I'm part of a team studying what happens to human consciousness after we die. We discovered something horrifying. How does it work? Death, I mean. How does it work? That was the point of the entire study, the trial. What happens when we die? Where do we go? What does it feel like? And is it even worth the hassle? Is there a heaven? A hell? We didn't know, but we wanted to. I suppose that's where everything went wrong, right out of the gate. We wanted to play God, or at least learn the rules of the game. To see behind the curtain for just a moment. If only so we could just know what to expect when the lights went out, and we said that final good night. I'm telling you now, swearing to you that we never intended for those things to go wrong the way they did. The people that lost their lives knew what they were getting into. They signed releases, paperwork. They agreed to let us do what we did, just so long as we promised to handsomely compensate their families. And we did. We held up our end of the bargain to the tune of $13 million. But things like this, they never work out the way they're meant to. I knew that. I did. I think that on some level, all of us did. But the people who were funding us had no idea. They wanted results. Be messy, they said, if that's what it takes. Do whatever you need to do to figure out what happens in the sequel to life. And make it snappy because this funding is running on an hourglass. And that sand is slipping. So we cut corners. We pushed people in ways that, in retrospect, were irresponsible, dangerous. But we did it for the common good. We did it for you. For all of us. For the benefit of future generations who could look death in the eye without the horror of knowing what came next. It was a good thing. It really was. The first death went smoothly. An older woman, 87 years old and dying of liver failure, was hooked up to our state-of-the-art equipment that had one job and one job only: to bring them back, to let them taste the cold kiss of death and then tear their soul back into the land of the living, long enough to give us a play-by-play of what happened while they were away. I know. This has happened before. People have come back from clinical death plenty of times, haven't they? Sure, that's true. But never after 3 days. The 3-day timeline was a tricky one, because even though the corpse was dead, even though the cadaver was cold and beginning to cellularly decompose, we needed to keep it fresh enough to host life. Don't get me wrong, the life it hosted didn't last long, but it lasted long enough. I still remember the pulse of excitement that shot through the room when the old woman opened her eyes. Her first rancid breath drew applause. "Agnes?" Roger, our research lead, said. He stood by her bedside, craned over her wearing a talk and gloves. "Can you hear my voice?" The woman nodded. More applause. We watched the two of them from behind the layer of one-way glass, all of us in our lab coats while Roger communed with the breathing corpse in what was practically a freezer. Their voices carried over a loudspeaker. "Where am I?" Agnes gasped, her throat trembling with the strain of vocalizing. "I'm tired." "You're with friends," Roger said. "Safe." Roger turned to us, grinning with a thumbs up. We'd successfully brought back our first subject, and not only was she alive, she was communicating, lucid. He turned back to her, likely knowing we had a limited window to extract the information we needed. "Do you remember the study that you agreed to be a part of?" Agnes's eyes opened wide, and her pupils seemed to jolt around like ping-pong balls. "Death," she muttered. "Death." Roger nodded, running a hand through her thinning hair. "That's right, Agnes. We wanted to know what happens to the soul after death. You agreed to take that journey and return to us. You're the first human being to ever have done so. Congratulations." I'll never forget what happened next. She gazed up at him, those rolling eyes, that absent voice, and she gripped the front of his shirt with a shuddering, frail hand. He leaned closer to her, no doubt thinking that she wanted to speak into his ear. "We belong," she said, her chest beginning to heave. "To them." Roger looked at us, his expression confused. He shook his head. "Agnes, I'm sorry. To whom are you referring?" Her legs jerked sideways. Her spine arching, she began to thrash on the slab. Blood leaked from the corners of her eyes. Roger, concerned, tempted to hold down the body so she wouldn't injure herself and compromise what little time she had left to communicate. He ordered more of us in. I hurried to his side with the 3 others. "We belong," she said again, and this time her voice was stronger, as though empowered by her agony. "To the forgotten." Even with 4 of us on her, each holding a limb, she was riding with a strength that could only be described as inhuman. Took everything I had to hold down her scrawny blue wrist to the slab. Beside us, the machine monitoring her vitals began to beep violently, indicating levels grossly out of range. "What comes next?" she hissed, and smoke began to drift up from her mouth. "Is worse than any hell." Before we could ask further, before we could subdue her and help her pass peacefully, she went still on the slab. Her limbs fell limp. Her buzzing pupils stilled. Her mouth ceased to smoke, and her head lolled to the side. Agnes Mick died for the 2nd time. We had her corpse carted to the morgue for an autopsy and discovered that her brain showed signs of hemorrhaging. Her heart had partially ruptured in her chest, and most bizarrely of all, her vocal cords had been seared, as if something had lit them aflame. Her results were ominous to say the least, but we were intelligent enough to know that a sample size of 1 does not a conclusion make, and so we eagerly awaited our 2nd subject. This one was a young boy named Jacob. He'd been struck by a vehicle in a hit and run and fallen into a coma. His parents never had an opportunity to say goodbye, and so they agreed to allow us to perform a study as long as they were there for his revival. The process was similar to Agnes's. Jacob lay unmoving on the slab in the freezer room, wires and diodes hooked up to his chest and temples, a white sheet draped across him. By his side stood Roger and both of the boy's parents, all of them clad in togs and gloves. Are you ready?" Roger asked. "Yes," they said. We all waited behind the glass with heart-pounding anticipation. Roger clicked a few keys on the computer console, and the machine began its mechanical song. A moment later, the screen flashed green as it indicated its afterlife sequence, filling Jacob's unmoving cadaver with a myriad of electrical pulses designed to shock his brain into functioning. The boy's feet, dangling outside the white cloth, began to twitch. Then his fingertips. His mother and father looked at one another, grasping hands as they waited for their son to return to them. Hopeful tears leaked from the corners of their eyes, their lips mouthing silent words of affirmation as they prepared to say goodbye to their son. Screaming filled the room. It burst through the loudspeaker like an explosion, causing all of us to jump back and scatter, our primal nervous systems fleeing while we attempted to uncover the source. But the source, I think, was always obvious, even if we didn't want to believe it. It was coming from Jacob. He lay there, his toes and fingertips twitching as his mouth hung open in an ear-splitting scream, his mother and father crowding him in horror, doing their best to calm him, assuage his pain, his confusion, his horror. It's difficult to describe the sound of Jacob's scream. I'm hesitant to say it was human, let alone the sound of a 9-year-old boy. It was most similar, I feel, to a drowning sheep. It was an anguished bleating sound, one that seemed never-ending, and yet it told a terrifying story all on its own. Eventually, Jacob's parents made the decision to pull the plug on their son. It was the second time they'd make the decision in little under a week. The last subject was the one that stuck with me, the one that haunts me to this day, and the reason I'm writing this now, sharing this with all of you. It was a woman named Charlotte, young, vibrant, in the prime of her life. Charlotte was an eccentric woman from a wealthy and educated family. she had spent her mid-20s traveling the world, primarily across portions of South America, as she researched content for her book, The Meaning of Life. The self-described shaman, Charlotte, put great stock in the spiritual practices of different cultures. She'd participated in hundreds of rituals across dozens of tribes. She tried everything from peyote to DMT, leveraging any drug she could get her hands on that promised psychedelic insights. Despite the heavy usage, Charlotte appeared to be perfectly clear-headed and not at all negatively impacted. To put it simply, she was as healthy as she could be. That's why we found it strange when she approached our small project and asked to be included. When we informed her that it was only for those suffering from terminal afflictions, she asked if she could be added to the list anyway, sort of like an organ donor. We agreed. Charlotte killed herself the following weekend. Bullet through the skull, quick and likely painless, though it's impossible to know for certain. Many times such acts of suicide last longer than the subject intends. Either way, we had our third volunteer. Charlotte's parents were initially opposed to the idea, but we informed them that we had her written legal consent. They asked to meet us halfway, to be there when she returned. After the situation with Jacob, however, we disallowed them for participating in the trial. The science is new, you understand. It's possible that emotional catalysts, like family figures, may have an adverse effect on brains so far removed from life. No, we said. We'll bring her back and we'll tell you everything that she says, and that will be that. So they relented. No lawsuit, no drama. We were free to bring Charlotte back from death in 3 days' time. And that's exactly what we did. The scenario played out like the others before. The freezing room, the beeping machine, the diodes sprinkled across her body, and the white sheet draped over her torso. Roger stood beside her, operating the machine while we monitored the readings. His fingers danced across the keyboard and the screen glowed with the words, "Afterlife sequence initiated." Once again we watched from behind the glass. Once again, Roger waiting patiently, a hopeful smile on his face. 20 seconds passed and nothing occurred. Not so much as a twitch of a toe or a flick of an eyelash. Charlotte's corpse remained every bit as dead as the day we carted her in. A minute went by, and we still saw no sign of resurrection. Roger looked back to the machine, shaking his head, and he removed his gloves, evidently wondering if he'd hit a wrong key with the mitts. He began the sequence again. The machine buzzed, and words flashed green across the screen once more, but Charlotte lay still. "Elliot," he said to me, his voice ringing out over the loudspeaker. "Can you come inside and check this out? I think it might be malfunctioning." I swallowed. I triple-checked the machine just to make sure it was functioning to specification, just as it had the last 2 times. Still, I nodded from behind the two-way glass and opened the door to the freezer. As I stepped inside the -30 room, I pulled a set of gloves and talk from the wall, began my appraisal of the system. The wires checked out. The programming was running to spec. All the diodes were in the correct place. "I don't see any issues here," I said, shivering. Roger frowned, looking back to Charlotte's cadaver. He placed his hands on his hips and cursed, wondering if, somehow, we'd encountered a dud. "Maybe just some people can't be brought back," he theorized. I opened my mouth to respond, but something about Charlotte had caught my eye. It was her lips. They were pulled into a thin grin, and black fluid was leaking from between them. "Have you seen it?" she muttered. Roger and I exchanged looks, and he slipped me a wink. "Well done," he whispered. "Now get back behind the glass." I obliged, not wanting to impact the experiment any more than I already had. "Charlotte," Roger said, "do you remember the study that you agreed to participate in?" She took a deep breath, and her body rolled upwards into a sitting position. This was new. Neither of the last subjects had showed anywhere near that level of physical control. Her blonde hair fell down around her as her cloth slipped onto the floor. "I remember putting a gun to my head and pulling the trigger." Roger looked back at us uneasily, as though unsure how to proceed. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Your parents were wondering if they had hurt you in some way, or—" "No," she wheezed, and her head snapped sideways to look at Roger. At the time, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, there was something decidedly twisted about her eyes. Much like Agnes's, there were buzzing around her skull, her pupils darting around like ricocheting hockey pucks. But this time her mouth was a tight smile. This time she appeared to be in control, aware. "I killed myself because I needed to know that my nightmares were real." Around me, researchers were hastily recording the details of her interaction, her words, her appearance, her biological readings. I gazed on in abject horror. To think that even then I knew that something awful was about to happen. I had that feeling, the one deep down in your gut that appears just before a car accident, or just before somebody's about to fall. And what was that? Roger said, his voice breaking as he stood next to Charlotte's buzzing pupils. "What came next after you died?" "Everything," she muttered, sweeping a leg off of the slab. "That I feared." Her pale foot hit the linoleum floor with a dull slap, and the other followed. She took a shaking breath and pushed herself off of the table until she was standing naked in front of Roger. "What do you think happens after we die, Doctor?" Roger looked sidelong at us from behind the two-way glass, his expression somewhere between nervous and fascinated. "I'm not certain," he said. "We all believe different things, I suppose. We were hoping you could answer that for us, Charlotte." Charlotte laughed, I think. It's hard to say, but she threw back her head and started choking irregularly. "We believe. Believe. She repeated the word as though tasting it. "We believe so many different things. We so desperately want them to be true, but the only truth is that we return to the forgotten." The forgotten. It was a phrase that we've heard before from Agnes, one in which I'd assumed it referred to human beings, like those who died in meaningless wars or in periods of widespread misfortune. And yet, the emphasis that Charlotte placed on it. "The forgotten?" Roger repeated, taking a step back from Charlotte's hunched-over body. It was miraculous that she was standing at all, but that she remained living after several minutes was something neither of the other two subjects had managed. What are the forgotten?" "Not what, but who?" Charlotte reached out, placing a pale hand on either side of Roger's shoulders. We watched with our breath held. She lurched forward, planting her blue, decaying lips on his. They touched only for a second before Roger instinctively pushed her backward, causing her to stumble against the metal slab. She laughed again in that choking, rasping chorus, sliding onto the linoleum floor. Roger rushed to her. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but our minds are finally made. She wheezed, not seeming to care. They evolved over millennia to mask reality, to mask the bitter truth of the universe. She spat black bile onto the floor, wiping at her lips with a shaking hand. You want to know what happens when we die? We return to the abyss that birthed us. The room around me began to murmur, some in interest, others in terror. I merely watched on, my heart racing and my mouth dry. I put a bullet through my skull, Charlotte continued, because I had a vision of the end. I saw our makers, and they were dressed in dying stars and empty space. They were hopeless, empty, but just like us, they wanted medicine, a way to feel. Roger knelt beside Charlotte as her voice grew quieter with every agonizing word. We are their medicine, she rasped. Our minds are primed for love, for joy, for pleasure. When we die, they feed on us. They leave our souls empty and rotting until we're rebirthed into the next human, a little less whole, a little less complete. Once again, that thin smile twisted its way across her blue lips. A little closer to putting a bullet through our skulls. Roger waved at us, indicating that he wanted to make sure that every second of this was being properly recorded. Then he turned back to her. What else can you tell us? That we began with meaning, but as they fed, and we grew emptier, more incomplete. Collectively, the human soul withered. Black bile poured from her lips now. It streaked down her pale body, pooling around her trembling legs like blood from a butchered lamb. Look around you. Do you feel the rage, the hatred, and the pain? It's consuming the human race like a plague, and bit by bit, we're getting worse, not better. Soon we'll have nothing left to feel. No love, no joy, just emptiness. Roger's mouth hung open. His voice stuttered as he attempted to formulate a response, to articulate why she must be wrong. At least, that's what I had hoped for. I'd hoped for anybody to stand up and say that this was all a farce, and the experiment had been compromised, and none of this could be true. But nobody did. Charlotte reached up and gripped Roger by the front of his shirt. If you want to know what comes next, I can show you. Roger looked at us through the glass, his eyes wide with shock and fear. He looked at us one last time, and I think he was waiting for somebody to shake their heads, to tell him that no, that was a bad idea, that he should decline. But we were all too shaken, and I think we weren't thinking straight. So he nodded and leaned into Charlotte, and then the lights flickered, and the freezer and our observation room were both plunged into darkness. The blackout lasted for just a second, maybe two, but it was long enough for everything to go wrong. When the light returned, the glass was cracked and the machine was wailing a metallic tone. Roger lay in front of Charlotte's naked corpse, his head face down in the pool of bile, smoke drifting up from his slack-jawed mouth. Charlotte's eyes were no longer buzzing. Her chest was no longer heaving. She had died for the second time. Roger had died for the first. After that, our funding was pulled. Our donor abandoned the project and scrubbed his involvement from any and all corporate records. As far as the scientific community was concerned, the experiments never occurred, and the findings didn't exist, but I remember. I remember because there's simply no way I could forget the haunting look in Agnes's eyes, the hopeless agony of Jacob's screams, or the final message that Charlotte delivered in black bile on the linoleum floor. It was messy and easy to miss. To the others, I think it must have looked like a common splatter, a simple side effect of her legs spasming in the pool of dark fluid. But I know what I saw. The letters, though crooked and barely legible, were scorched into my memory like a candle brand. They weren't so much as a warning as they were words of advice, perhaps an answer to the question we set out to ask, and the question that Charlotte had set out to answer in her book. The meaning of life, she wrote, is to avoid the agony of death. Thank you for listening to Whisperwood Stories. If you enjoyed, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe down below. Do you have a story that you'd like me to read here? Consider commenting or sending it to whisperwoodsubmissions@gmail.com. The stories in this video were read and may have been slightly altered, with individual authors' permissions. Thank you again for listening, and be sure to check out the original Reddit post and links below where you can find more from our authors. Don't let the shadows get too close.